Right, lovely. So yeah, without further ado, it's my utmost delight today to introduce Eric Wishart, the Standards and Ethics Editor and former Editor-in-Chief of Agence France-Presse, who is the author of the book we'll be talking about today, Journalism Ethics, 21 Essentials from Wars to Artificial Intelligence. And moderating this session will be Robin Ewing, Senior Lecturer in the Department of Journalism at Hong Kong Baptist University. All right. Robin, want to take it away?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all for being here. I'm excited to be talking to Eric today. I did bring a copy of his book to my talk, if anybody wanted to see the cover. And so I thought I would start with the book, Eric. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about what motivated you to write a book on ethics, and why do journalists need this book?
Um, Hello, everybody. Thanks for the introductions. Um, in addition to my work at AFP News Agency, I also teach journalism at Hong Kong University. I teach principles of journalism, and I'm about to start teaching international conflict reporting again at Baptist University. And any of you who've taught will know you have to draw up reading lists for your students. And what I found was going online, there are very few books about journalism ethics available. And without criticizing them, because they all have their qualities, they tend to be very US focused. And I found very US text focused, very kind of out of the sort of AP school. But there was no book that really embraced the challenges, the ethical challenges increasingly that journalists face now. Um, there was no book that covered beyond the basics when it starts accuracy, seek the truth, independence, impartiality, fairness, correct mistakes. Beyond the sort of basic stuff, I found there were no books that would also cover photo responsibility and photographic images, which I think Robin we're going to talk about later. Specific coverage areas like elections, LGBTQ issues, representation of women, which is a big topic, climate change, which is, the number one story going forward. And this is life on the planet we're discussing. Um, and also I discussed war reporting as well, but also introduced a chapter on safety. And again, I think we'll talk about that a bit later, because safety until now has not really been categorized as something that's a sort of ethical responsibility in journalism, but it very much is. So, having looked at the reading lists and not seen a book that fitted the description of the one I just talked about there, I thought the only option is to write one yourself, so I did. I've got quite a short attention span, so it's Robin's got it. It's quite tight. It's not that long. It's divided into 21 chapters. And it also has questions, sort of three questions at the end of each chapter so that if you've read the chapter, you should be able to answer the questions. And the questions are actually based on real examples. They're not, I don't think you would necessarily identify the cases of the journalists involved, but they're based on real examples I've come across. The second part of the question, why is it important? I think the I think we really are faced in real time with kinds of ethical challenges that didn't exist when I started in journalism 50 years ago, folks. I think online social media has changed that. I think the responsibility we have as journalists to people we cover have increased because once it's out there, it tends to be out there forever. Journalists are facing and bombarded with very tough images these days. Um, I think artificial intelligence has raised a lot of ethical questions. Elections, the way elections are conducted now with so much disinformation flying around, raises ethical questions. So I think ethics, which, as I say at the start of the book, was something that was never discussed when I started in journalism. I don't know about you, Robin, but I mean, for us, we never really. I mean, it was a pretty unethical profession. Get the story any way you can, you know. I think we're living in a very different world now, which is why I wrote the book.
Absolutely. Well, why don't we dive into some of the chapters? You have a
Hmm.
big section on elections, and
Hmm.
obviously one of the most complex news stories of the last year has been the U.S. presidential election. So maybe you can speak a little to some of the ethical challenges that journalists faced in covering this last election, and any lessons that maybe journalists have learned or not learned.
I mean, it was interesting comparing 24 to 2016
Right.
when journalists fell into the narrative driven by opinion polls and also bias against Donald Trump that Hillary Clinton would win. And I've got this wonderful set of slides of all the stories before that election, basically saying Hillary Clinton will win. It's not even close. What kind of president will she be? And then they got it completely wrong, and there was a lot of soul searching. This year was different, but it was still very poll driven. And I think, again, there's been a lot of soul searching about the polls because although it was relatively close, I mean, at the end of the day, it wasn't close at all. And it was a particular, if you looked at the numbers, it was particularly the numbers on the Democratic side fell. It was not so much that Trump improved dramatically in his numbers from 2020, it's that um, Kamala Harris was significantly lower. And so, you know, I followed the election very, very closely in the American media and international media. And I think I mean, I talk about this in the book, that I think one of the worst, I think beyond purely spreading disinformation and fake news, I think one of the biggest problems we have in journalism is following narratives. Um,
What are some of
and
the
I don't
narratives
think,
that you saw?
sorry.
So what are some of the narratives that you saw?
Yeah, I mean, I think you shouldn't confuse following a narrative with following the story, obviously. But there's this kind of slight pack mentality when you get in an election. I mean, the 2016 narrative was that Hillary would win and Trump would lose. This year, you have the narrative that Biden was too old. And then there was well, they can't just anoint Kamala Harris. It's going to be, a disputed convention. It's going to be chaos. And then suddenly Biden, you know, endorses Harris. So suddenly it's all about Harris. She has the convention. So suddenly it's the great bound. She's going to trounce Trump in the polls. She's 6 points ahead in the national poll. And then suddenly everyone gets a bit shaky near the end. And then there was all this stuff about sane washing. You got to sane wash. There was a lot of internal criticism. Like, we can't just cover Donald Trump like a normal candidate. So it's sane washing means that you listen to one of his rambling speeches for 2 hours and then you produce what looks like a coherent version of his speech. So, in the middle of all this, where was the coverage of all these more than half of voters who were going to vote for Trump? And they weren't all. And I did find that, I mean, there was some great reporting, of course, but I do find that there is just like in 2016, and I suppose 20, although that was a bit of an unusual election. Um, I did tend to find when journalists eventually went out from New York and Washington to report on Donald Trump supporters, they were all MAGA people in MAGA regalia, you know. Um, so there was still this tendency to cover, I would say, to cover, the interior of the United States once you get away from the coasts as almost like a foreign country.
Hmm.
You never visit, you know. You only visit it once or twice a year. You go to a diner, you speak to some bikers for Trump, and you'll have somebody with a flag in front of City Hall, and you come back to the comfort of where you come from, and you present it like that. And I think that's still pervaded. And I think that ethically, if you look at accuracy and seek the truth, I think the seeking the truth in this election was really to get out and really see how real people lived. Spend a week with a family who go to the grocery store and go to the gas station. Then you'd be picking up the signs of what's happening, more than these dip in, diner, conversation around the table with MAGA and Harris supporters. And you have this little vignette, but I still feel didn't really represent what was going on. And of course, now there's all the soul searching. Right. It was only after the election what you could call the mainstream media discovered the manosphere that Trump had been plugged into, the Joe Rogan podcast and the other podcasts and the JD Van podcast with these people. Yeah, they were. I mean, the mainstream media seemed totally oblivious of the manosphere and the way that the Trump campaign was targeting that before the election. It was a discovery after the election. So, yeah, so I think there's no substitute in an election for getting out and speaking to people, and not just dipping out and presenting them like caricatures,
Resisting the narrative. Got it.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so continuing with the election, I mean, the ethical challenges certainly aren't over. We're seeing people with track records of misinformation being pointed to administrative positions, like I'm thinking specifically like Elon Musk and RFK Jr. So what advice do you have for journalists having to deal with the future Trump White House when there's all kinds of, inflammatory comments or misinformation? Like, how can journalists ethically handle that going forward?
You can't, I mean, the way that news is consumed these days, you just can't give a platform to dangerous disinformation. Right. I mean, there obviously is a hierarchy. I mean, not every, you can't be the gatekeeper for everything. But I think the definite red flags with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. He is spreading and has spread dangerous medical disinformation. He started on fluoride, which has been generally proven to be a safe chemical that prevents dental cavities. But the big one is vaccines. I mean, he went to, I think it was Samoa during a measles outbreak and campaigned basically against them taking measles, and it was catastrophic. I think they had 5,000 cases and 85 people died, including a lot of children. So when you're playing around with vaccines, this is deadly. This is serious stuff. This isn't just,
right.
This isn't the nonsense disinformation, just as it was during COVID. So what the journalist's responsibility is you have to frame dangerous information. And this is one thing I teach, which was an idea of a cognitive scientist called George Lakoff. I think he first raised it in a discussion with Brian Stelter on CNN. He calls it a truth sandwich. Okay. I mean, it's an easy concept to remember. Basically, you have to frame the lie with the truth or the disinformation from the truth, because cognitively, the first thing you hear will stick in your brain. They call it the stickiness of lies. So if you read a story saying Robert F. Kennedy Jr. say, vaccines, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. again insisted that certain vaccines could lead to autism, which has been roundly disproved. It was proved that it was first reported in a study that has subsequently been proved to be bogus. But he continued to say that. Also, he said there's no such thing as a safe vaccine. I think he said that a week or two ago. That's got to be framed with the truth, because people are going to read that. So you can't just say Robert F. Kennedy said today that vaccines, parents should be really careful because all vaccines are potential dangers from lack of brain development in children, etc., etc. You have to frame it by saying, despite overwhelming scientific evidence to the contrary, Robert F. Kennedy again repeated his claims that vaccines are dangerous. a theory that has just been widely discredited
Right.
At a time when, when scientists point out that vaccines have saved billions of lives. Okay, so you've got to frame it. So that's one way of doing it. Yeah.
Um, I love that idea of the true sandwich.
Yeah.
We were talking about narratives earlier, and I think we'll move on from the election. I wanted to talk about labels, right? So one of the
Yes.
narratives we saw in the election was calling Trump a fascist,
Mhm.
which is a label, and we've seen that used many times. I know in the Philippines, I remember when Rodrigo
Mhm.
Duterte got called, the Punisher. But recently, AFP got criticized in the French Senate, right, for
Mhm.
refusing to use the word terrorist, particularly in reference to Hamas, but also for all militant groups. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the ethical decision behind that.
Yeah, and I was in the middle of that because this was after October the 7th. And as we always do, um, we don't call Hamas terrorist. Um, and we said Hamas militants, gunmen stormed into Israel, killed more than 1,200 people, dragged 250 hostages into Gaza, went into graphic details, published graphic photographs of what happened, which was horrific. But we were criticized because we don't call them terrorists. I mean, one point I say about the word terrorism is I don't understand why people get so heated about it, because once you've described what they did, what is sticking a label on do? And so we traditionally don't do it, but I think part of the criticism was that people thought this was a special role for Hamas, which it wasn't. I mean, when I was editor in chief of AFP, which was 99 to 2005, I went back into the archives actually because our news director, Phil Chetwin, and our chairman, Fabrice Friess, were actually summoned to testify at the French Senate, about our use of terrorism and our coverage of Gaza. So it got to quite a high level, And so I was asked to write an article for AFP explaining our use of terrorism. And I went back in the archives and I found a note I wrote when I was editor in chief in 2020. This was at the time of the PLO and Yasser Arafat, that we don't call Palestinian militants terrorists. So it wasn't a new rule, which was good. That's why it's good to keep archives. And we never called the IRA terrorists. We had a terrible incident in Afghanistan when the Taliban came in and murdered one of our staffers, his wife, and two of their children in a restaurant. Like cold blood. We didn't call them terrorists because by sticking it, you stick a label on somebody, and then not everybody sees these people as terrorists, and it comes down to one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. And I know it's a cliche, but governments traditionally will brand independence groups, separatist groups as terrorists who then join the government, who then years later become mainstream politicians. And of course, the example I gave in my article was Nelson Mandela, the most famous one. He was jailed by the South African government as a terrorist. Nelson Mandela was on the State Department terrorist watch list in the United States until 2005, after he'd left the presidency, right? So, I mean, he started the Spear of the Nation, which was the militant wing of the African National Congress. He advocated violence. He met Yasser Arafat in the territories and said, if peaceful means don't work, you must resort to violence. So, and then he became the world's greatest statesman and the president, but that got jumped on. How could I compare Hamas to Nelson Mandela, which of course I hadn't done. So this is all part of the thing. So I think it's good, in a news agency. I think in the privately owned media, they do have obviously the flexibility to label things. That's the way it's always worked. But for a news agency with thousands of clients of all persuasions around the world, and the same goes for Reuters, BBC, AP. All the big media have the same rule on terrorism. Actually, we all
Right.
don't stay. You'll call somebody out for falsehoods, but we won't call them a liar.
Right.
That sound okay? Yeah.
Well, you mentioned, the AFP journalist that was murdered in Afghanistan, and I know that, Jim Foley was working for AFP as a freelancer
Yeah.
in Syria when he was killed. And I think this is one of the first times I've actually seen the idea of journalist safety referred to as an ethical issue rather than a practice, right? So can you tell us a little bit about the ethical decision making, maybe the duty of care responsibility by news organizations, and why you chose to include safety in your book?
Mhm. James Foley was an American journalist who worked for the AFP in Libya, first of all, and then worked for us in Syria. And he was kidnapped in Syria during the whole civil war with ISIS. It was at a time we weren't really sending foreign correspondents in. We had our local staff. We have an office in Damascus, but we were still taking content from freelancers. He was kidnapped 2 years later, appeared in a video, um, was beheaded for these guys, which was absolutely horrendous. And so the news director at the time, Michel Leridon, took a decision that we would no longer take content from freelancers in areas that are too dangerous for our own journalists. Okay. And then it grew into an international news coalition, actually, of big media who basically adopted a charter. I think it was the News Safety Alliance, roughly something like that. You can find it online. I think it was under the Dart Center.
Right.
And it was that you share the same responsibility to freelancers as you share to your staff. I mean, so some freelancers pushed back, said it's not up to AFP to tell us where we can or cannot go. But it was the right decision. If it's too dangerous for AP, AFP, or Reuters, you shouldn't be there, you know?
Okay.
So it's an ethical responsibility. I think there's two forms of ethical responsibility. If you define, ethics is a massive, huge philosophical discussion, but in the world of journalism, if you can simply define ethics as a code of ethics, as a roadmap for good, responsible behavior as a journalist, I think that's a reasonable, simple description. Sets out the roadmap of how to be a good journalist, how to be different from all the other people that are posting online. You have rules. You don't manipulate photographs. You don't make stuff up. Seek the truth. So I think there are two main areas of ethics in journalism. One is the ethical responsibility of media sending people into harm's way. Okay? So that's your duty of care to your staff. When I went in 1992, I was sent to cover what was supposed to be the second round of the Algerian elections and became the start of the Algerian civil war, which was extremely violent. I had no training at all. The only training I got was don't stand near the office window because they're shooting and you might get hit by a bullet. So great. So I stayed at the back, So
Right.
come 2000 and then when we went into 9/11 and Afghanistan and Iraq, we decided with the team in Paris that we needed to introduce mandatory hostile environment training. So the rule is at AFP, you don't go into a war zone unless you've been given training, equipment, and you can be tracked, and you have a manager who will say to you, this is too dangerous, right? And you don't go. Still doesn't stop a Russian grad rocket killing
Right.
an AFP journalist, Armin Soldin, in Ukraine last year. I mean, there's a limit, or Or a Reuters photographer, Issam Abdullah, being killed in South Lebanon by Israeli tank shells last October, which in an attack that which Christina Assi, an AFP journalist, lost her right leg. There's a limit to what you can do, but at the same time, when that incident happened, Dylan Collins, who's another AFP journalist, had undertaken hostile environment training and saved Christina's life because he put a tourniquet on her leg, right? Which takes me to the ethical responsibility you have as an individual going into a war zone or a danger zone. It's very easy to cover a war now. It's quite easy to cover Ukraine. You go to Poland, you get in a train. At least that's what they were doing. Armed with a phone these days, with an internet connection, you can cover a war. But if you go into that situation, you have an ethical and moral responsibility to be trained. If you're with other journalists and you get your phone on and you're geolocated, you could be targeted.
Right.
All that kind of stuff. You've got to know that stuff. If you decide you're going to stand up and have a look around, you can attract snipers or whatever. If you're crazy enough to start flying a drone around, you probably get hit by a missile or another drone. If the person next to you gets wounded and is bleeding, which is the most common, probably one of those common ways of dying, bleeding to death, you're there. You have to be able to know basic first aid and save that person's life. You shouldn't be there if you don't. So I think that's an ethical, moral responsibility as well.
Absolutely. The organization and the journalist.
Yeah.
What about duty of care or ethical responsibility for journalists in newsrooms? Maybe not in conflict zones, but dealing with graphic images, which you have a section on in your book.
Yeah.
Is that there too?
It's called, if you're out in the field, you come back, you can get what they call post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. We have a system now that before, when you came back, you would just kind of go to the beach, which wasn't the best bet. You'd be lying beside the swimming pool and your head would be like a washing machine churning that stuff over. So now we have a system of debriefing. People come back, they get debriefed. We watch them. It's normal to have flashbacks or whatever, but it persists over a month. Then you're getting into the realms of actual PTSD. We're subject to a constant flow of horrendous graphic imagery, right? So the way to deal with is, and if you get traumatized by that, it's called vicarious trauma, which is almost like third-hand trauma from seeing this stuff. And sometimes it can be worse. The way we handle it is to minimize exposure to it. You have to minimize exposure to it. If you're dealing with it there's some basic rules which I teach in my class. Don't look at it in a darkened room in your big iMac with your headphones on, right? You got to minimize your exposure to it, minimize the image, turn down the sound. If you've ever seen, and I hope you haven't, a video of a person being beheaded, sound is as bad as the image, and it stays with you. So turn down the sound, avoid repeat viewings, share it. Don't send anything to somebody. Don't send any horrible graphic image to somebody without a warning. Okay. I got a real shock during the protest. Somebody forwarded me that terrible video of a man being set on fire. I don't know if you remember that. It just popped up on my WhatsApp and I was really annoyed. I mean, I see horrible stuff every day of the week. I was really annoyed about it. I wasn't ready for it. It was upsetting. So you got to prepare your staff. One thing we instituted, and I mean, I see the incoming from Gaza every day, which is horrendous. Yeah, I've never seen so many dead kids in my life. So I was getting nightmares at the start, but I suppose I'm acclimatized to a degree. But what we do is we have a filter now that, for example, if you're on the sports desk, the graphic imagery is filtered out, the sports photo desk. So if you're editing photo of sports, you're not also getting the Gaza stuff. So we've introduced some filtering so that only people who have to see it. But we do counsel, and we do have a helpline where we subscribe to an online international helpline for people that are having it. because it's been, I mean, between Ukraine and Gaza and Lebanon, it's been very tough. And this isn't a virtual thing. I mean, our
Right.
photographers in Gaza lost 20, 30 family members, right? And they kept working.
Right. So is it something that editors and newsrooms are aware of? Are you training AFP journalists
Mhm.
to monitor their own, viewing of these images? Yeah.
And mental health has become a really important factor. And I mean, I go back for the annual editors meeting in Paris, and we have a training day all about mental health. And there's also the question of where do you publish?
Right. Right. We'll have lots more topics for you, Eric. If anybody in the audience wants to ask a question, please go ahead. I'm monitoring the chat box, and I can read your question out to Eric. So we can talk about AI if you'd like to, Eric.
Sure.
Right. So I see so many articles day after day after day. A lot of it's fear mongering. So maybe you can, and we've been using AI in journalism for over a decade, but
Yeah.
with generative, and I think your book addresses really generative AI. I wonder if
Yeah.
you could give us a little bit of a summary of what some of the ethical issues surrounding the use of generative AI in journalism are.
I think it comes, I mean, on a basic level, I mean, our job is to inform the public
Right.
and to create an informed republic, not republic, public, and to tell the truth. And it's not to present a virtual version of reality. So we have to be transparent in our methods. And ChatGPT came out in like 2008, 2020, November 2022, I think it came out, but it was really sort of popularized in February of last year. So I
Right.
looked at it quite closely and I wrote these guidelines with the AFP team, and then I put the chapter in the book. And that we're getting up for like 18 months later. The needle hasn't moved much
Right.
on the ethical front, which is interesting. You
Hmm.
know, basically, if you take generative AI out of it, obviously these are tools that have been used for a long time. AP, I think, started using a form of AI to produce automated company results about 10 years ago, 2014, I think. Um, Obviously, the game changer was AI, but first of all, I mean, all this stuff about it's the end of journalism. Will we
So
still need
post-truth, that was the buzzword, right?
will we still need journalists? Well, actually, the game changer in journalism was social media. That was the change. That was the change. That was when the journalist was no longer the gatekeeper, and suddenly everybody could be a journalist or some form of journalist. So that was the game changer. That transformed journalism. I mean, journalism has always developed thanks to technology. So you've got to embrace this new technology. So a great backroom tool, if you can say that. I think the important thing is what are you going to publish? And I mean, we wrote the guidelines, the ethical guidelines that's in the ethics. It was the first update we did of our ethics code at AFP since 2015, since I wrote them in 2024, and the entry was on AI. So it's serious, right? Um, the ethical issue is what are you telling your public? Are you presenting the public with the truth? Or are you presenting them with your own work? Same problem that students have, obviously. And if you look at the number one, when I wrote the ethics code for AFP, I looked at as many ethics code around the world as I could see. And the number one priority in all of them was accuracy, right? And if you're using generative AI to produce your content and you don't check it, you're going to fail in the number one ethical thing because you are going to publish stuff that's not correct.
I've seen it happen.
Even if they'll claim they're 99% accurate. That's 1% wrong. So
Yeah.
that's it. So you're going to fall. Secondly, we talk about the hallucinations. Obviously, it's improved enormously. But I mean, as of yesterday, and I use it, I use ChatGPT. I don't find Gemini always that great. Perplexity, I find quite good.
Yeah.
But they put in mistakes. They put in stuff that's not accurate, out of date, and I mean, I've been reading recently is that there's a limited amount of data, out there that they can train themselves on. So, so that's, and also images. Your responsibility is to show people the world as it is, not a pretend virtual,
Right.
version of reality. I've seen videos. I've seen Gen AI. I've seen Gen AI videos of Gaza. I've seen Gen AI images of Gaza, and then I've seen what I see every morning from AFP from photographers.
Right.
Don't let's kid ourselves. Not the same. Okay.
Right.
Great tool, but I mean, if you use it for translation, I mean, AFP transcription and translation very helpful. But I'd be most interested to see what the transcription of
Right.
this discussion would be with my accent. Transcription for interviews is a really useful tool, but you have to go back and check the quotes. Likewise, I mean, if it's just for a reference translation, it's great if you just want to know what the communique said in Arabic or whatever. But if you're going to publish a Hamas statement on AFP that was translated from Arabic to English, you need to speak Arabic and English, right? You can't do it blind. So it can be quick for an editor who might not be publishing it or writing it, but just to get a quick idea of what went on, great. But it's human oversight is essential. And yeah, and I've just seen so many terrible. Oh, right. The other point I wanted to make, and I don't think did people like these AI generated weather people
The
speaking?
avatars, I mean,
Yeah,
kind of like VR, like it's a new tool, it's fun, and then everybody
I
kind of
know,
gets tired of it.
I know. I think another interesting thing on AI is that audience resistance to it,
Right.
which probably should get more publicity than it does. The Reuters Institute produced its annual digital report and did a very in-depth international study. A lot of resistance particularly to automatically AI generated stories being published by journalists, images. They didn't like the avatars, right? There was another one, Trust Media Project in the US, came up with very similar findings that there's public resistance to it.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, there is.
Sorry?
I was going to say, yeah, and even when I hear podcasts where they're using AI voices, you can just tell, and it's kind of
Yeah.
annoying. Right?
I used to listen to this really good. I don't remember what it was. It was it was an app, and they played. It was an Audible app. It wasn't Audible. It was an Audible app where they read out long form stories from like the New Yorker, New York Times, Washington Post with human
Right, right.
voices.
Yeah.
And the New York Times took it over, and now I think it's all AI voices, and it's just I stopped listening to it.
Yeah.
So I think it's not being, you know, backward thinking or against progress. I mean, I put AI in the title of my book. I'm dealing with it at AFP. But I mean, when you've got so many threats against reality, conspiracy theories,
Right.
you really still have to produce stuff that's real. And I'm not sure that's going to change. But it's a generalization, but generally they're great tools, obviously.
Hmm. Well, let's see. It looks like we got our first question
Okay.
about, let's see,
Facts.
well, Kat Wong has a question, and she wants to know about, how news is being used to train generative AI models, right? So she's talking about the New York Times, and the
Yeah.
lawsuit OpenAI. And then we have, she's mentioning the Atlantic and how they're partnering with OpenAI now. I've also seen the FT, Associated Press. A lot of organizations are partnering with OpenAI at the same time. The New York Times is suing them. And it says, what are your thoughts on news organizations that are linking partnerships with AI companies? Is joining forces with AI ethical? And more broadly, is it inevitable?
Thanks, Kat. I don't think it's inevitable. Anytime I say something's inevitable, it inevitably doesn't happen. I think we're not there yet. It's very interesting that there's a kind of split between suing them and joining them. I think one problem is lack of transparency. And I think that's one thing that Perplexity is quite interesting on. I actually asked it a question the other day, and it quoted the AFP. I asked them list 10 ethical whatevers, I don't know, about some story. And it actually listed AFP's ethics code as a source, which I don't remember them asking to do that. But I think that if it was an agreement and it was transparent, maybe, But I think an interesting thing is to have your own chat, your own GPT. I mean, I think a fantastic tool, and I think Bloomberg has or was developing it, would be in-house. I mean, AFP doesn't have its own, AFP GPT, which would be great if you could put your entire, because that would eliminate this problem of what do you call it? Outside content that you can, if you work for AFP, I mean, you can't ask ChatGPT because it could produce you a Reuters story. That's not going to work, to quote from. So, I mean, I think having your in-house system would be really good, I went to the Hindu newspaper in Chennai quite recently, and they're going to use artificial intelligence in their editorial system to monitor the stories conform with the style book, which would be great. So I'm not convinced if you can't beat them, join them. I mean, we sued Google because they were using our content and we were getting no revenue. So, but I think inevitably with big tech, you have to work with them.
Right.
But it can't be on a freebie charitable basis.
Yeah, I agree with you about the inevitable part, and but I do think that it's probably the direction that we're moving. I just got a message from my colleague Cherian George, who wants to
Go ahead, Cherian.
And I think he wants to ask you directly instead of typing it.
Nice.
Cherian, are you there?
Yep.
Hi, Cherian. How you doing?
I mainly wanted to personally congratulate you, and it's great that the book is out. Yeah.
Thank you.
But as an excuse, I'll ask a question. So it's a broader point, really. I mean, I guess media organizations brand by values, so to speak, right? And ethics are a great way to brand yourself. And in an ideal world, those that have strong ethical values will be more respected and therefore more believed and so on. But of course, we're not in an ideal world, and we're in a very polarized world. And one thing I've noticed is, especially, I guess, in this context where I guess journalism's biggest global challenge right now is the war on Gaza. Yeah. And my guess, just based anecdotally on talking to people, is that a clear majority of people feel that professional media organizations have failed the test. That the Gaza war, and quite tragically, considering that more journalists have died in the Gaza war than in any other conflict, right? But the Gaza war just shows how unreliable, unethical, and pointless professional media are. So I'd like to hear from you how you would respond to this, I guess, understandable despair and frustration.
I mean, I've heard that, and I watched. Do you watch the Listening Post?
Yeah.
Yeah, they did this really strong attack on the BBC and I think CNN were basically ignoring the plight of the Palestinians in Gaza. It's a very interesting question. Um, I think one problem is that people are not seeing, they're not having access to the production from Gaza from AP, AFP, and Reuters. I mean, the situation is that the Israelis don't allow foreign press in. They'll only allow foreign press in as an embed with the Israeli army, so it's extremely controlled. But foreign correspondents can't get into Gaza, and they would line up and go in. I mean, they're fearless, as you know, Sherian. So we have every morning I go on to my morning routine. I look at the incoming. It's actually the content that we're sending to our clients. I tend to look at the client war. Dozens of photos every day. Destruction. Lebanon as well. Obviously, we did it on October the 7th, terrible images and in the kibbutzim and subsequent to that and the images that came out of the Hamas attack and the videos. So we covered all that. But it's very concentrated now on Lebanon and on Hamas and Gaza, I mean. And every day we cover that. We have Palestinian journalists in Gaza producing images of what's happening there every day. And I'm sure AP and Reuters are doing the same thing. People aren't seeing them. That doesn't mean they're not being done, right? So there's also this kind of mentality you tend to get in a lot of the big international media is if we're not there, the story's not being covered. They have complete disdain for local journalists, completely wrongly, you know. Some of the best photographers you'll ever work with are the Palestinian photographers in Gaza at huge personal cost, but people aren't seeing it, that stuff is being filtered, it's being published on a sort of selective basis in the mainstream media, as you would say. So I think it's not that the content isn't there, that people aren't seeing it, and I think that also is, and I was speaking to a young journalist in the States before coming on in Seattle, just to give me a get a sense of things. I think a lot of the protests that we see in the States, the pro-Palestinian protests among young people, are being fueled by what they're seeing on Instagram and TikTok, which bypasses traditional media. You're not going to see the kind of stuff. You're not going to see, I mean, the bodies I saw in Gaza this morning, you're not going to see that on the front page of the South China Morning Post of the New York Times. The dead babies. You're not going to see that. So they were seeing that on Instagram, on TikTok, and I follow some of the people, and it's genuine. You're always subject to manipulation on social media, as you well know. But this is genuine stuff. These are people living there, and I think a lot of the passion that has been created around this has been through that vector, that way, through that social media route, more than mainstream media, which you could call it, I think, and Twitter as well. There's a lot of stuff posted on Twitter. Some stuff obviously is fake, but I think some people have genuinely established themselves as journalists and doing a form of journalism in Gaza. I think Lebanon is more covered. There's a much bigger media presence there. It's open to the media, So like AFP's there, and we've got a big bureau in Beirut. So journalists are covering that more.
So just to clarify one point, that when you say that the mainstream media are not going to put those gory images on page one or even at all, right? Do you think this
Or not
is
all of them,
just
maybe,
a
Cherry.
traditional, pardon?
Selectively, yeah, selectively.
But do you think this is them just applying their conventional standards of taste, or is it a form of political censorship?
don't know. I mean, I've read a lot about this, and I don't get the feeling that, and I'm sure some people will contradict me, but I feel there's been a lot of very sympathetic coverage towards Palestinians. Not so much sympathetic as just factual coverage. And there's been factual coverage. We gave a lot of coverage to the UN commission that came out, special commission that came out yesterday, I think, saying that they were highly, there were a lot of the criteria met that Israel was committing genocide in Gaza, just as came out at the international court. But so that stuff's covered. I watch CNN and I watch the BBC, obviously Al Jazeera. I read the papers. There's a lot of coverage of the suffering in Gaza and in Lebanon. So I don't know if it's really fair or not. I'd like people to give me examples of why it's not fair. And I'm very open-minded on it. But we as a news agency have been very committed to it. We're there, we are there. And we'll be there. We had 14 Palestinian journalists in Gaza when it started. They also blew up our office. I don't know if you've seen that photograph, but there's a big hole now where the AFP office used to be in Gaza because we were live streaming. We had a live stream, 24/7 live stream. And obviously, the Israelis didn't like it, so they blew it up. It's a tough war. I've never seen anything like this before. 40 years of journalism. And it's different because you see it more in real time now. I've never seen so many dead children. Tough.
I've got one more question. I think it actually is a good one in reference to what you just said about bypassing traditional media.
Yeah.
Alexa Villano, she says she's working as a digital designer and former entertainment reporter. She says, we've seen the rise of podcasts during the US elections. And how will these types of platforms play a crucial role in elections worldwide, given some of them don't follow journalism ethics?
Yeah, the interesting thing with podcasts is how they've moved on to YouTube. So the nature of them has kind of changed. People like watching Joe Rogan with his guests. I think that it was interesting. Again, I was watching this. It was CNN, and they were talking about voters getting their news from podcasts from Joe Rogan. But they're not getting their news from them. It's entertainment, and a lot of its time it's not political. And a lot of the news, obviously, they talk about, they've not reported themselves. They might be criticizing the mainstream media or whatever, but where are they getting the information they're talking about? So, but I think it was definitely quite striking in the election that Trump turned down. I think he turned down the interview with CBS. But he did Joe Rogan, and he did 2 or 3 others as well.
Well, and Harris did the, what does it, Call Your Daddy podcast as well? So it wasn't just on his side.
Yeah. But she also turned down Joe Rogan.
Yeah, she did.
Which,
probably rightly so.
Well, people think it might have been a mistake,
Okay.
So yeah, I think it's interesting. And a lot has talked about it, and I think it played a role in the election. I think this manosphere thing is a phenomenon, but it's not new. This manosphere, this kind of thing is not new, not a terribly appetizing concept in many ways, but it's not new. And but it's almost like fine, but it's it's not covering an election. It's opinion. There are no rules. It's entertainment. It showed Donald Light, Trump in a particular light. He's got into this whole UFC thing. So, it's a whole space that's opened up and is developing, but, fine. It can coexist, and particularly, I think, for elections, it's particularly useful, but it can certainly coexist, but it's not going to replace reporters on the ground covering news, obviously, the COP29 or, whatever, But I mean, just the information space has exploded to such an extent. That's coming back to the book. This is why you have to come back to the basics, accuracy, seek the truth. I don't mind if Joe Rogan wants to, have a 3-hour show if he tells the truth. If he's peddling lies and not to, if he's peddling lies, influencing people to vote or act in a certain way on vaccines or something that's detrimental to their health, that's a problem. And that's unethical. Doesn't matter if you're a journalist or not. You're being unethical as a human being if you're giving people dangerous information about vaccines. I'm not saying that Joe Rogan would do that, but his guests might. So I think, I think these particularly now, I think these ethical fundamentals are really important. And I mean, another thing I talk about is representation of women and LGBTQ issues. And now you have this horrible situation in the US, House of Representatives, where they want to bar a transgender woman from the women's toilets. You saw Marjorie Taylor Greene has weighed in on this. And so you have to, and I think language very important. So I think a chapter like that explains also difference between, assigned sex at birth and gender. So I think if you're going to cover these things, you have to be armed with this kind of information. And and just finally, I think, news organizations, what also sets them apart is transparency about their working methods, which includes publishing your ethics code. So if somebody says, "Why should we trust you?" You say, "Well, don't trust me. You read the ethics code, and then you make your decision. You see our rules on quoting people or whatever.
Right.
But I would definitely draw a line though between the kind of Joe Rogan example of chat and entertainment and these people in Gaza or Lebanon or Ukraine who are actually doing their form of journalism to TikTok or Instagram.
Right. We do have 2 minutes left, and I have a question from Nabia in Jakarta. And it's going back to the AI. I know we talked a lot about AI in back end, but she wants to know what you think of using AI to summarize and draft articles for small newsrooms with an end product supervised by the editor. So she's curious on your thoughts on that.
I mean, it's being done already. I mean, I think a lot of this also comes down to budget,
Right.
doesn't it? You know, I mean, CNET tried to do this. They used,
But it was a disaster.
yeah, they decided they would save money. And so they produced stories using AI, and 50% of them had mistakes in them. Okay. So I think you've got to be really wary. I think another thing, it can actually waste time.
Mm.
You have to balance the time saved with them doing the summary for you and the time used checking it. Okay. Or are you just going to take that leap of faith and believe it and push it out? And people are doing that. I know. But again, it comes back to, it's the unknown. And I'm not talking about the AP example was a bit different. I mean, it was pure data. I mean, you're putting in your own content and asking it to summarize. So theoretically, it shouldn't add anything weird, theoretically. But would it summarize the way you would want it summarized? And the trouble I find if I ask it to do a translation, I don't ask it to write text for me, but I've asked it to do a translation. You're locked into its translation. And they're never really what you want as a French English speaker. So you're immediately trying to modify it, but the result is never what it would have been if you'd just taken the 20 minutes to do it yourself.
Yeah, I
It's a
think that's
balanced
good.
question. So, but yeah, I mean, great for summaries for sure, bullet points, but check it. Always check it.
All right. Well, I think that is actually perfectly on time. We'll go ahead and stop there. I just want to say a few things. First of all, if we didn't get to one of your questions, Eric has kindly agreed to say that you can contact him on
Sure.
LinkedIn if you want to discuss anything with him directly. Again, Eric, I also want to congratulate you. It's a real accomplishment to put out something so comprehensive and interesting,
Thank
and I've
you.
really enjoyed reading my copy. And for those of you who are interested in buying a copy, it is on Amazon, or if you're in Hong Kong, it's at the Hong Kong University Press Store, bookstore on the HKU campus, right? So thank you. That was fantastic.
No
Always a
problem.
pleasure talking to you, Eric. And I hope all of you have a wonderful day. Thanks.
Thanks everybody for joining.
All
Thanks
right,
for
thank you. Yeah,
listening. Thanks for
Appreciate it.
listening.
thank you, Eric. Thank you, Robin.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right,
Bye.
bye.
Bye. Oh, Michael was here.
All right, I'll be ending the call
Okay,
now.
fine.
Thank you, Eric.
Okay, thanks. Bye-bye.